Hey guys, what's up? My name is Sky Webb and I'm here to talk about a true crime story that I cannot get off my mind. But before we get started, I just want to put out a little disclaimer that I mean no harm to any of the victims or the victims' families, and I wish everyone who was hurt within this story the utmost peace and solace, either in rest or in recovery. With that out of the way, welcome back to my channel, or just welcome if you've never been here before. My name is Sky Webb and this is True Crime Thursday. Today we're looking into the disappearance and murder of Shauna Howe, and this case was actually recommended by one of you guys in the comments, so I really appreciate getting recommendations on like what cases to cover. If I haven't done your recommendation yet, it's either because there just wasn't a lot of like interest in it, or because I just haven't gotten around to it because I am very slow. So I do apologize, but I am working through them. I will get to it eventually, I promise. Shauna Melinda Howe was an 11-year-old girl who lived with her mum Lucy, her stepdad John, and her older brother and younger sister in Oil City, Pennsylvania. And just like any other 11-year-old, she loved her friends, loved her siblings, of course bickered, argued with them, but you know, was full of life, had a lot of love for the people around her and vice versa. She was a part of the Girl Scouts, which was a really great way to make friends, and she was really popular there, and she was also a part of the choir. She liked to do a lot of like extracurricular curricular activities, and she basically just really enjoyed being a part of things, which also meant she loved Halloween. Halloween is actually when this story took place, and if you know me and my channel, you would know that every year I do Halloween stories, and this would be perfect for Halloween time, but I didn't want to wait. I want to do it now, so I'm doing it now. So Shauna was a huge fan of Halloween and an even bigger fan of dressing up and wearing costumes because she was a really creative kid and she just thought it was fun and a great way to express herself. But in 1992, her family didn't have the money to splurge on a costume. But for Shauna, that was fine because, as I said, she was a really creative kid and she loved costumes and expressing herself and doing all of that. So she was absolutely fine with making her own costume this year. So Shauna was able to put together a gymnast costume for Halloween, and she thought it was pretty good. So she was super excited to wear her own costume on Halloween and show it to everybody. So on the 27th of October, she had planned to go to school like normal, a normal school day. She then had a choir concert after school, which was at a retirement home. And then after that, she had a Girl Scouts party, which was actually a Halloween party. So she was super excited for that as well. So the Girl Scouts all decided that they would meet at this church, which wasn't too far from Shauna's house, and then they would all go to their party as a group. So Shauna was given a curfew by her mum, which was around 6 or 7. So she was told that's when she had to be home, and that was absolutely fine with her. Her mum also told her that she'd organized for her to get a lift because her mum was working. And she didn't want Shauna walking home in the dark, which Shauna was in total agreement of because she was actually quite scared of the dark. It really spooked her. So she was more than happy to come home at that time and get a lift so she didn't have to walk. But this made it really easy for whoever Shauna's mum was going to organize to take her home because, as I said, it was nearby. So it wasn't, you know, really out of the way for anybody. But at around 8 p.m, Shauna's mum called home, and this was just part of her schedule, her daily schedule. This was normal for her to call home and just check that the kids are fine and, you know, how's it all going, because she worked a lot and she worked late. But on this night, when she called home, she realized that Shauna wasn't home yet, which means she was well past her curfew, which was 6 or 7. As it turns out, Lucy, which was Shauna's mum, had been just way too busy, jam-packed at work, and had completely forgotten to organize for her to have a lift home. So at this point, Lucy was worried, but she wasn't panicking in the way that I think a lot of other people would be. But she just assumed that Shauna would be walking home by now, or she would have gotten a lift from one of her friends from the Girl Scouts because, you know, that makes sense. It's already been an hour. Clearly she would have known that nobody's coming by now. She's a smart girl. She would have just walked home. So at around 8:30 p.m, John, which was her stepdad, got in his car and decided he would drive around and see if he could see her and then go to the church and see if she was there, which I just don't really understand because he was only half a mile away. Couldn't he have picked her up instead of Lucy having to organize a lift? Also, when he realized that Shauna wasn't home, why didn't he raise alarm bells then instead of waiting for Lucy to have to call home to realize? Weird. Anyway, he drives to the church, and when he gets there, there is not a single person in sight. So at this point, they're starting to freak out a fair bit. So John starts driving up and down all of the streets between the church and their house, searching for Shauna, but can't find her. Lucy then calls Shauna's biological dad, hoping that maybe the Girl Scouts might have called him and he might have her, but he said he didn't and he hadn't seen her. So then Lucy calls one of Shauna's best friends from the Girl Scouts and asks, do you know what happened? Do you know where she went? Like, help, give me something. And luckily she did know where she had gone. So Shauna's friend explains to Lucy that they sort of realized nobody was coming after they had waited around for quite some time, and her friend was obviously waiting with Shauna because no one was there to pick Shauna up. Her friend, however, did have her dad there ready to take her home. So her friend offered, like, hey, no one's coming to get you. Do you want to come with me and my dad? My dad can drop you off. Like, it's fine. He won't mind. As long as you're safe, as long as it's all fine, we don't want to leave you here. And Shauna just wasn't really sure about that idea. She wasn't a fan of getting in a car with like some man, even though it was her friend. And so she declined and said that she would just walk home and it was fine. So now her parents call the police because they're figuring that, you know, John has already gone up and down the streets and can't find her. They're definitely not going to be able to find her by themselves. And walking home, she should have been home by now, and she wasn't. So they were really, really worried and they wanted help. So when the police arrived, they're told everything that has happened, given a description of Lucy and the church and the party. They're just told all of this information. And the police actually realized that at around 8 o'clock, they received a phone call calling in a child abduction on the same route that they assumed that Lucy would have taken to walk home. So this report was made by a man called Dan Padden, and he says that he saw Shauna walking home, can describe her costume from head to toe, and says that he saw a tall, skinny man with a top hat on approach her, speak to her, and then just grab her and run. So Dan actually ran after them, but they turned a corner. And so when he followed, he heard a scream, but he couldn't see anything except for a red car just taking off. And so he immediately gets on his phone and reports this to the police because obviously this is very alarming. But because it was so sort of early, the police just sort of sat on it. So now the police are taking it seriously because they realize there actually is a poor little girl who has been abducted, which is just nuts that they didn't listen to the first phone call. What the hell? So the police now call all of the sort of surrounding police stations to fill them in, give a description of Lucy and let them know, like, hey, keep a lookout, we have a missing child. And then they start putting roadblocks at sort of all the exits of the town so that they can stop all of the cars coming in and out. Well, mostly out. And check their cars and their boots to see, like, obviously if there was a girl in there. And then they also send people to both the church and all of the surrounding roads trying to search for Shauna. So I do a lot of child abduction cases, or I have in the past, and in majority of those, the parents are very active when it comes to the actual physical search for the children, like in the first 24, 48 hours type thing. But in this case, it was actually different because the police suspected a ransom call to be made to the house. So Lucy, her mum, had to just stay at home and sit by the phone and wait for this ransom call, which is just crazy. I cannot imagine sitting by the phone waiting for like a kidnapper to call me about my daughter. I cannot fathom what was going through her head. But just like all of the other child abduction cases, the one thing I have to give the people is how well they come together in like a tragedy like this. I can't say there's many things that will bring everyone together. I mean, I guess like maybe like natural disasters and stuff, but even then there's still sort of like selfish people, whatever. But when it comes to missing children, everyone gives their fucking all to try and find that children, and they do in every case that I cover. Like, it's just amazing. So props to the people. But yeah, just like all the other cases, a lot of the community started looking for her, started to try and assist the police and the family. We're bringing the family like food and care packages and, you know, all that kind of stuff, and everyone was just trying really hard to find Shauna. The community was, however, very cautious of then celebrating Halloween because, I mean, there was a child snatcher out on the loose, so nobody really wanted their kids to go walking around knocking on strangers' doors while there's a kidnapper. So the people were sort of split up into little search groups, and one of the leaders of one of the search groups was actually Shauna's uncle, and so his group found something, and this was 2 days after her disappearance. So they actually found a little piece of fabric, and it was a turquoise fabric, the same fabric that was used to make her gymnast costume for Halloween. So where this was found was like a little river that ran through the town. It was very secluded. People pretty much only went there like to hang out because there was no one ever there, or to like go fishing or camping, but that was pretty much it. There was no other reason to have been there. So they took that fabric and sent it off to the lab to be tested. Unfortunately, they were able to determine that poor little Shauna had been sexually assaulted. So when they were searching this sort of river area, which they continued to do after the results had come in, they thought at this point that she was alive. That was until the very next day, a camper spotted a dead body in the water. Where her body was found was actually only 500 meters from where they found the piece of fabric from her outfit. So to the police and to her uncle especially, it was just absolutely beyond them how they didn't find her body, because they searched this area so thoroughly that they just could not comprehend how they would have missed her. So Shauna was found face down in the water, wearing a pair of shorts and a back to front t-shirt. And her shoes were actually found up on a bridge that, you know, went over the river, and they were facing opposite directions. And this is something that the police and the community and the search parties were all baffled by as well, because they had searched that bridge and there were no shoes up there. So they performed an autopsy on Shauna's body, and they were able to determine yet again that she had in fact been sexually assaulted. They had also determined that she'd been sort of, you know, kicked and tossed around before she died. They found a shoe print on her face, on her cheek, which makes me feel sick because she's such a young girl. She would have already been fucking terrified, and then it's just like, ooh. They determined her death was blunt force trauma, but they also determined that she had most likely been shoved or pushed off of the bridge, falling onto the sharp rocks below, or while still being alive, and then died 30 minutes after she had landed. 30 minutes. That's a long fucking time to be in pain for an 11-year-old girl, dude. So this bastard stole her, sexually assaulted her, bashed her, and then kicked her in the face off a bridge to fall 33 fucking meters just to hit rocks and then die painfully and slowly 30 minutes later. Why, dude? Why? Like, I don't understand why you can't kill people in a more nice way, you know? I don't know. The autopsy also found that Shauna hadn't been tied up or restrained in any way. She didn't have any marks on her body to suggest that. They also determined that she'd been thrown off the bridge a day after they'd already searched everything, and they sort of took this as a sign of the perpetrator sort of toying with them, because they'd obviously already searched the area, and then now they find her the next day. They're like, now the town as a community as a whole had sort of already agreed that like Halloween was cancelled. You know, none of their adults at least were happy to, you know, partake in Halloween this year because of Shauna's death. But now, after the body had been found, the police actually made it like an order, like, no, Halloween is cancelled, cancel your parties, don't go out, stay indoors, like, we're not doing it this year. And because of this, people who, you know, weren't too fond of authority, mainly teenagers, decided that they would start vandalizing the town, writing horrible fucking messages, right next to elementary schools, mind you, saying like, you'll be next, watch your back, just shit like that to scare people and to just toy with everyone. And honestly, if they're dumb enough to do that, I hope they're dumb enough to also headbutt a brick wall, because what the fuck? An 11-year-old girl just died? You fucking shitheads. And next to elementary schools, like, those kids are scared, bro. This just made the town erupt into chaos, like utter chaos. This, for a lot of those kids, was the first introduction to death that they'd ever had. You know, like, elementary is still pretty young. 11-year-olds haven't seen a lot of death, you know? So to first of all have that be your first introduction, second of all it be a murder and a kidnapping, and they weren't found, and now they've got scary messages all around the town. The kids were fucking terrified, and because the kids were scared, the parents were scared, and because the parents were scared, the parents were mad, and it was chaos. Now, if you have ever seen like a PTA meeting, like the parents who are involved in the schools, you will know that they're a little bit crazy and a little bit full on. So when these parents are freaking the fuck out about their kids being kidnapped, they decided to let their kids start walking around with pepper spray, which I'm sure you can imagine could cause, you know, some issues when all of the little kids are walking around carrying pepper spray and weapons. But that's what they were doing. They were told that they had to stay in groups. They had to always have, you know, a weapon, pepper spray, something to, you know, protect themselves, self-defense at all times. And then the parents set up like almost a kid watch thing where there was always like one parent per so many kids like walking to and from school. So they were fucking scared. And the police sort of had the same view as I do, that kids that young maybe shouldn't have weapons like that, even if it is for self-defense. And so the police were like, whoa, they're too young for that. Can't have kids walking around doing that. Calm down. And there was no calming down. The parents did not give a fuck. They wanted their kids to be safe, and they wanted their kids to be armed. And as I said, parents who are very full on like that can be a little bit crazy. And so they started pointing fingers at anyone in the community who was a little bit quiet or withdrawn or that they found odd, and they would start telling everyone, I think it's them, they're the murderer. Everything everyone did was for show at this point because no one wanted to be called the murderer, and it was just nuts. One of the people who was really popular as, you know, the accused murderer was actually Shauna's uncle. And if you remember, Shauna's uncle was the one who led the search team. He was heavily involved in, you know, the search for Shauna. And a lot of people thought that it was him who might have had something to do with this. And that's because he was the one that found the fabric. All of the men in Shauna's family, including her 12-year-old brother, which I just think would be so confusing and hard for him at 12 years old, they all had to give a DNA sample for them to, you know, run through and see if anything matched the DNA profile. Luckily, nobody in her family matched, including her uncle. He was not a match, meaning if he had something to do with it, did not do the actual, you know, probably not, but just put it together, I don't know. Her poor uncle, who he worked really hard to try and find her. He was really heavily involved because he wanted to find her. He was a good man doing good things. And he was just treated like shit. He was called disgusting names, told disgusting things, told he should go rot, he should die, he should this, he should that. Even after being cleared. At this point, they just started giving out DNA tests like it was COVID tests. Like there was just DNA tests going on everywhere. Anyone who seemed weird, anyone who was quiet, anyone who was withdrawn, any kid that anyone had seen look at Shauna ever at school, DNA test for you, DNA test for you, DNA test for you, DNA test for everyone. And nothing came of it. So finally the FBI had to get involved because it's a case about children and that is scary. So the FBI does my favorite thing in the world. I just think it is so incredible. I love it. I just think it's insane, and it goes to show that we're not as like special and unique as an individual as we think we are, because we literally can be profiled so easily just based off like the tiniest amount of actions that we've done one time. Do you know what I mean? It's crazy. So anyway, I haven't even said what it is. The FBI does this thing called a criminal profile. So they basically take one action in a murder that they know has happened, like throwing her off the bridge, something like that. And then they look at all the statistics of all the other crimes committed by people who have done similar crimes. And then they look into their, like the statistics of all their lives. Does that make sense? I explain it better in the Kristen Costas, I don't know, cheerleading video. I'll put it up here somewhere. Yeah, it's incredible. It is really incredible. It's just so interesting. I love it. So the FBI makes this criminal profile and they determine that the suspect is probably a Caucasian male in his 20s, and they determined that he would have a big behavioral shift after the crime was committed, which to me again is just such an interesting thing to even be able to determine just based off of other people's statistics. That's nuts to me. So they actually asked the public to think about this really long and hard and think about all the people that they know and think like, has anyone you know quit work suddenly? Has anyone moved away when they didn't previously have any plans to? Has anyone changed their daily routine all of a sudden? Has anyone broken up with their girlfriend or started drinking, started using substances? Has anyone made a big shift in their lives? I personally think that this is absolutely crazy to ask the public. Obviously it can be useful because you get a lot of suggestions, but they had already seen what members of the public had done to Shauna's uncle, which was horrible, and he was innocent. So why would you give them more ammunition to go out after anyone? Lots of people quit their jobs, lots of people break up with their girlfriends. It doesn't mean they're a murderer, but now the public thought maybe they were. So just like you would suspect, the police were absolutely flooded with tips and insights and suggestions of who the murderer may be. There was one man whose name kept popping up because he had left town the day after Shauna went missing, and he was just sketchy according to everybody. But his name was Michael, and he wasn't able to be located. So the police kept searching, kept looking for, you know, other avenues to go down. And so finally they get a phone call from someone claiming a man named Ted Walker fit the description of the man in the hat, the skinny guy, and the red car. So Ted was in his mid-20s, he did drive a red car, and he also worked at a pizza shop which Shauna and her friends, the Girl Scouts, would often go to after school, and so they knew him. He was also a smoker, which the witness claimed the culprit was smoking, so this was all really fitting. And now that his name had sort of been brought up and mentioned, a lot of the community were stepping back and saying, oh, like, didn't think of it till now, but yeah, he is kind of creepy, yeah, he is kind of sketchy. Hey, he always hugged our girls, he hugs our daughters, and like maybe holds on for a little bit too long, like what's this about? As it turns out, a lot of the Girl Scouts were actually afraid of him because they would go to this pizza shop sometimes multiple times a week, and he was very friendly with the children, but it was that kind of weird, uncomfortable friendly where it's like, oh, don't look at me, like, I hope you don't see me. The girls would hide from him because they didn't want to be hugged or touched or be fussed over by this man. But he did a DNA test, and when it came back, he wasn't a match. So at this point, the police were absolutely stumped. That was until a retired detective who has worked in some of the most notorious big murder cases ever, he actually came to the police and said, guys, this murder was done by more than one person. There was multiple people who took her life. And this information now made police look at two brothers, the O'Brien brothers, who both had an extensive criminal record, both of which had sexual assault under their belt on that criminal record. One of the brothers, James O'Brien, he was just caught up and involved in a attempted abduction case. So this is sort of what drew the police's attention to the brothers in the first place. But after looking into them, they realized like both brothers didn't match the description. Neither one of them was tall and skinny, and they were actually in prison at the time of the kidnapping. So they figured it simply couldn't be them. They didn't even bother to give them a DNA test. So if we fast forward to 1997, a couple of years after Shauna's disappearance and death, a detective who worked on Shauna's case was put on another case which involved Tim O'Brien, which was the other brother. And now the town had organized this thing that with every crime that came in, every single person would be DNA tested for Shauna's case. They were absolutely not giving up on her, and so they figured if this person came in again for some other crime, we'll get him, we'll catch the bastard. And so Tim O'Brien's DNA was taken and tested against Shauna's fabric. As well as doing this DNA test, this is just absolutely crazy to me. They would ask questions about Shauna's murder and about, you know, where they were, this and that, years after it had happened. And to people who were involved in cases completely unrelated, they were determined. And I just think that is amazing, crazy, but amazing. So the DNA sample comes back and it's negative, and they tell Tim this, but the detective finds his demeanor to be just very odd. When he was talking about the current crime that he had committed, he was kind of chill. He didn't really react or do anything weird, but when he was being asked questions about Shauna, he seemed really unsettled and uncomfortable and a little bit fidgety and just awkward, you know? And it was because of this just weird behavior that the detective decided he wanted to pursue him further about the Shauna case. So this detective, God bless his heart, he decided he would go back over the interviews, the original interviews with the brothers, because they obviously were interviewed the first time around looking into Shauna's case. And he realized that some very, very incompetent, very fucking lazy police work had been done. And when the brothers told them that they had been in jail that night, the police simply saw that they had been arrested and so assumed, yeah, they were in jail. That's fine. They don't have a red car. They're not tall and skinny. Can't be them. They got an alibi. It's fine. Let's go home. Go watch the footy or something. I don't know. But what had really happened was they had been arrested, but they were let out on bail, meaning they were free to roam the town all night, the night that Shauna went missing. So this is when they start searching for James O'Brien, because they now want to test his DNA to see if he's a match. And then the DNA test from James O'Brien comes back and it is a match, which means James O'Brien is the one who sexually assaulted Shauna. At this point, they know James had sexually assaulted her, but they think that Tim may have been the one that killed her. What they didn't understand was how a red car came to be involved, because neither brother had any connection to any red cars. They also couldn't figure out why the description of a tall, skinny man was so off from, you know, what the brothers actually looked like. So they dig and dig and dig further into the brothers' lives and what they were doing around the time of the disappearance, and they actually find out that the brothers were living with a man at the time of the disappearance named Ted Walker. Ted Walker, the skinny guy that worked at the pizza shop that all the girls were creeped out by and scared of, that was originally one of the main people to be mentioned. Ted Walker has a red car, as we know, I mentioned earlier. But police assumed that this red car was just a project car. It didn't work. It was, you know, sitting out the back. And he worked on it. But instead of testing or getting him to demonstrate that it did not drive, they just assumed and believed him when he said that it didn't. So the police track Ted down, and when they find him, boy did he have some shit to say. He tells police that one night he and the brothers were just sitting around laughing about how crappy the police in this town were, how bad they were at their jobs, how incompetent they were, and so they collectively as a group decided that they would pull off a crime to show and demonstrate to the whole town what pieces of shit essentially the police were. And so they decided that they would go and kidnap a kid in front of witnesses, have them at home for, you know, a couple hours, whatever, and then let them go so that they could just laugh at the police and how crappy they are, and everyone would think it's so funny. So the police just couldn't understand in this story, if they were to believe this story, how did it go from just something that they were doing to fuck with the police to then actually being an assault and murder? How does that happen? Ted didn't give them any answers as to how it would have changed from that to that, you know? And so they kept looking into him, and it wasn't until a neighbor actually called the police to report him burning a mattress in his backyard. Doesn't get much saucer than that. And then they were able to get a warrant to search his house before he could burn any more evidence. At this point, Ted Walker is plastered on TV screens on newspapers. And so the original witness, he ended up speaking with police and confirming that that is in fact the person that he had seen. Now with the police and the media, you know, breathing really heavily down Ted Walker's back, he changed his story a little bit, and he said that on the night of Shauna's disappearance, he was actually at like a store, and he came out and saw his red car driving past him. So he followed it, and the brothers were in there, and they explained to him that they wanted to carry out their little plan to mess with the police, and they decided to do it that night instead of doing it Halloween night, which is what they originally had planned, which makes sense because there's going to be kids everywhere. But for whatever reason, they decided they wanted to do it on the 27th of October. So they asked Ted to, you know, help them. And at that point, they actually saw Shauna walking down the road, which is when Ted went up to her, knowing he knew her and she knew him and it would be easier. So he went up to her, asked her for a hug, which she gave him, and then he just scooped her up and ran. So Ted and Shauna go back to Ted's house, and then the brothers all go back to Ted's house, where Ted then starts making dinner for his own son, which is just like, oh my god, while the brothers and Shauna go upstairs. At this point, Ted starts to hear screaming, and he says he ran upstairs to see what the fuck's going on. Ted tells police that he genuinely believed that Shauna would just sit upstairs peacefully for, you know, maybe half an hour tops before they would just let her go again. And, you know, that would be that, and it would all be just some funny thing to laugh at the police. He claims that that's all he thought was going to happen. So when he did hear this screaming and he ran to check, you know, what was happening, he reckons that the brothers told him to just mind his business and get the fuck out of the way, because if he didn't, his son would be next. So he took his son and they left the house. So when he came back by himself without his son, Shauna and the two brothers were all gone. Now the police were absolutely positive. They were so sure that these three men were the ones responsible for these crimes, but they just didn't have enough physical evidence to actually tie them to it. They could obviously pin James for the sexual assault because they had the DNA to prove it. So he was physically tied to the crime, but his brother, Tim, not so much, and Ted wasn't tied to the crime really at all, except for the fact that he had given sort of a confession-ish and had the red car, but they couldn't even prove that that red car necessarily was the red car. So they just didn't have a lot of physical, tangible evidence, and so they continued to work on this case for a number of years, even after finding those three men. In that time that the police were working on this case, trying to pin the brothers and Ted for their crimes, the brothers managed to sexually assault another boy and another young girl. So finally, in 2004, all three men were arrested, and only 2 days after their arrest, Ted agreed to do a plea bargain where he would get a 3rd-degree murder charge as opposed to like a 1st or 2nd-degree murder charge, which is what it would have been, in exchange for testifying against the brothers, which he had no issue doing because he claimed he didn't want it to happen to begin with. Ted, however, managed to stuff this up. His one job, instead of saying, like he did originally to the police, that he arrived prior to the brothers, meaning he saw the brothers physically carry Shauna up the stairs. When he was on the stand testifying against the brothers, he changed his story and said that instead of that happening, he had arrived home after the brothers, meaning he hadn't physically seen them carry her upstairs. As for the brothers, they were used to this kind of thing. They were used to needing to get out of sexual assault cases, pretty much. So they blamed the entire thing on Ted, which was pretty easy to do because it was his house, it was his car, both of which he admitted. Tim was not connected physically to the crime at all. It was only James, but because the brothers were living at the house, James claimed that he had had sex earlier that night with a woman of age consensually, and so if Shauna had have laid on that bed, she might have, you know, got his DNA like that. Due to the lack of evidence, though, the brothers, they were acquitted of a first-degree murder charge and a rape charge, which is fucking disgusting because at the end of the day, that's exactly what it fucking was. There just wasn't enough evidence, which is really fucked up and proves their original point that the cops were kind of a little bit incompetent. They were, however, found guilty of second and third degree murder, as well as kidnapping and conspiracy to commit kidnapping, which is better than nothing. I mean, really, that's all we could have hoped for. That's all anyone could have hoped for at that point, because it had just, they'd almost gotten away with it. They were both sentenced to consecutive life sentences, and they will never leave prison. They will never see a day of fresh air outside of those prison walls ever again. Thank fucking Christ. So the brothers are away for good, and Ted, he was charged with the third degree murder because he did testify. And as for the town, they actually continued to cancel Halloween every single year, only going out in the daytime, like for trick-or-treating and for Halloween parties, anything like that, all had to be done in the daytime. And as soon as it hit nightfall, everyone's inside, no festivities to be had. And that was all the way up until 2008, when a girl in, middle school, she actually started a petition to be able to, celebrate Halloween again, because she felt like her and the other kids were missing out based off of something that happened years ago, whatever. And so the town then did start celebrating Halloween again, thanks to that little girl. After 16 years, the town finally sort of agreed collectively that they were going to let go, they were going to move on, and while they will always remember Shauna, they cannot live in fear of Halloween every fucking year. So, props to that girl, I guess, for sort of reminding them it's okay, like, you can't live in fear forever. So that is the case of Shauna Howe. Please let me know what you think of this one in the comments down below, or you can head over to any of my social medias. They'll all be linked in the description down below, and you can let me know there. Be sure to give this video a big thumbs up if you feel like it. I would really appreciate it, and be sure to subscribe so that you can see all my new videos. I post every single Thursday, except for when I don't, and I'd love to have you be a part of it. Make sure you guys are being safe out there. Don't hug random creepy pizza guys just out of obligation. In fact, don't hug anyone out of obligation, and stop making your children hug people out of obligation. Don't be polite to people who don't deserve your politeness. Just tell them to leave you the fuck alone. You don't gotta swear, but you get my point. Don't forget to organize lifts for your young daughters, making them walk home. No shade to Lucy, but like, and most importantly, don't fucking kidnap children, you monsters! Thank you guys so much for watching. Stay safe. Bye! I'm enough to headbutt a brick wall. Oh, my foot.